There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the familiar quiet of your own apartment, and they slip in under your guard. You don't recognize them as watersheds until long after the tide has turned. For me, that moment smelled of the damp wool of my favorite gray blanket and the faint, clean scent of Liam's shampoo. He was asleep on my couch, a place he had never slept before, and I was sitting in the worn armchair across from him, pretending to read a book on photographic theory that had lost all its meaning. The only thing I could study was the architecture of his stillness, the slow, even rhythm of his breathing that seemed to be setting the new pace of my own heartbeat. This was a border crossing, and I knew it. A line, previously invisible but deeply felt, was being blurred. Our friendship had always been a structure with clearly defined rooms, and for years, I had been content to live in the one assigned to me, the one labeled best friend. It was a comfortable room, filled with easy laughter and shared histories, but its windows only looked out onto other, more distant parts of his life. I never tried the connecting doors. I was too afraid they were locked. But tonight, he had walked through one of them without knocking, dazed and seeking refuge, and had simply fallen asleep in the heart of my territory. And I, the quiet cartographer of our dynamic, was left to redraw the maps, wondering if this new geography was a temporary annexation born of his crisis, or the beginning of a whole new world. It hadn't always been this way, this fraught and tender silence. Our friendship began in a place of noise and motion, baptized in the echoing acoustics and chlorinated haze of the university swimming pool. We were both on the team, but we were different kinds of swimmers, which is to say we were different kinds of people. Liam was a sprinter. He was pure kinetic energy, a contained explosion of muscle and will that churned the water into a fury for 50 frantic meters. His races were breathtaking, violent, and over in an instant. He lived his life in much the same way, a series of bright, intense bursts of social energy, laughter, and grand gestures. He collected friends like medals, effortlessly charming his way through the world. I was a distance swimmer. My domain was the long, grueling haul of the 1,500-meter freestyle. My race wasn't about explosion. It was about endurance, about finding a rhythm and sustaining it, about managing pain and silencing the part of your brain that screamed for you to stop. It was a lonely discipline, fought more against yourself than against the person in the next lane. I was quiet, patient, an observer by nature. My chosen path outside the pool was photography, a profession that was, in its own way, another form of distance swimming. It was about waiting for the right light, about holding a single, perfect composition in your mind, about the patient, solitary work in the darkroom where you coaxed an image into existence. I watched the world through a viewfinder, framing it, understanding it, but always keeping it at a slight remove. Liam and I should have been nothing more than teammates, two different species inhabiting the same ecosystem. But he had sought me out. I remember the day clearly. I was in the stands after practice, toweling my hair dry, watching the last of the water polo team finish their drills. He came and sat next to me, dripping and breathless, his usual supernova energy dimmed to a low, friendly glow. He didn't talk about practice or his win from the last meet. He pointed to my old film camera sitting on the bench beside me. He asked me what I saw through it. It was such a simple question, but no one had ever asked me that before. People asked to see my photos, the final product, but he asked about the process, about the act of seeing itself. That was the beginning. We discovered a shared language in the quiet spaces between his noise and my silence. Our friendship was built in late-night diners after grueling practices, our bodies aching and smelling of chlorine, where he would recount his day in vivid detail and I would listen, offering a quiet comment here and there that would somehow make him laugh or see things in a new way. It was built on long drives to away meets, the landscape of some forgotten highway blurring past the windows, the car filled with a comfortable silence that neither of us felt the need to break. He was the subject of so many of my early photographs, though he rarely knew it. I have a whole box of black and white prints of him, captured in unguarded moments, laughing with his head thrown back, the chords of his neck defined, staring out a bus window, his reflection a ghostly double, sleeping, his face softened and vulnerable. I told myself it was practice, an exercise in capturing the human form. I was a prodigious liar, especially to myself. My feelings for him were a room I kept locked, the key swallowed long ago. They were a low, constant hum beneath the surface of my life, a warmth I carried in my chest that was both a comfort and an ache. I was so adept at hiding it that I sometimes convinced myself it wasn't there. I was the keeper of his secrets, the steadfast, reliable friend. I listened to him talk about the girls he was dating, offering what I hoped was sage and impartial advice. Each name was a small, sharp stone in my shoe, a discomfort I learned to walk with. I watched him fall in love with Sarah, a bright, kind art history major, and I attended their parties and smiled and told them they were perfect for each other, and I meant it. I wanted him to be happy. That desire was more powerful, more urgent, than my own selfish, secret wanting. The architecture of my life was built around the certainty of his friendship, and I would have sooner torn the whole building down than risked the foundation by confessing the truth of what I felt. For 3 years, this was our equilibrium. Stable, predictable, safe. Then came the phone call that washed it all away. It was just after 2 in the morning on a Thursday, the kind of soul-crushing, silent hour when any ringing phone carries the immediate premonition of disaster. I fumbled for it on my nightstand, my heart thudding against my ribs. It was Liam. I answered, my voice thick with sleep. Hello. Silence. Then, a sound that I had never heard from him before. A choked, fractured breath. The sound of a man trying to speak around a knot of grief, so tight it was strangling him. Can I? He started, and his voice broke completely. He tried again. Can I come over? Of course, I said, already out of bed and pulling on a pair of sweatpants. Liam, what's wrong? Are you okay? Sarah and I, he whispered, and that was all he needed to say. We're over. It's done. I'll buzz you in, I said, my own heart aching in sympathy, and with a small, treacherous flicker of something else I refused to name. When I opened my apartment door, he looked like a shipwreck. His hair was a mess, his eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, and he was wearing a wrinkled t-shirt and jeans, as if he'd just thrown on whatever was on the floor. He, who was always so put together, so vibrant, looked like the color had been drained from him, leaving behind a pale, shaking outline. He didn't say anything. He just walked past me into the living room and sank onto my couch, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders were shaking. I didn't know what to do. The usual script of our friendship had no lines for this scene. All our interactions were predicated on his strength, his easy confidence. Seeing him so completely undone was like watching a law of physics be repealed. I did the only thing I could think of. I went to the kitchen and made him a cup of tea, the same chamomile blend my mother used to make for me when I was a child and couldn't sleep. My hands were trembling slightly as I brought the mug to him. I set it on the coffee table in front of him and then hesitated, hovering uselessly. Finally, I just sat down in the armchair across from him, a safe distance away, and I waited. The silence in the room was vast and heavy. It was filled with his pain. After what felt like an eternity, he lifted his head. His face was ravaged. She said she felt like we were moving in different directions, he said, his voice raw. Like we were just roommates who were fond of each other. That the spark was gone, he let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded like tearing fabric. 3 years, and that's it. A fucking spark. I listened. I let him talk. He unspooled the whole miserable story, the arguments, the silences, the final, awful conversation. He talked about his own failings, his fear that he'd taken her for granted, his terror of being alone. I was no longer his friend. I was a priest in a confessional, a silent receptacle for his pain and guilt. I murmured reassurances, told him he wasn't to blame, that these things happen, all the useless, necessary platitudes we offer in the face of heartbreak. He spoke for hours, the words pouring out of him until he was empty, until the sky outside my window began to soften from black to a bruised purple. He finally fell silent, his head leaning back against the couch cushions, his eyes closed. He looked utterly exhausted, like a swimmer who had gone too far and had nothing left to bring him back to shore. I don't think I can go back to my apartment, he whispered. Everything is hers. Her stuff. Her smell. He opened his eyes and looked at me, a raw plea in his gaze. Is it okay if I just stay here? On the couch? Just for tonight? Of course, Liam, I said, my voice softer than I intended. Stay as long as you need. I went to my linen closet, and pulled out a pillow and the heavy gray wool blanket. As I unfolded it and draped it over him, my fingers brushed against his arm. His skin was cold. He flinched slightly at the contact, not out of revulsion, but like a man in shock, overly sensitive to any stimulus. I stepped back quickly, my own skin tingling where we'd touched. "Try to get some sleep," I said. He just nodded, his eyes already closed again. I retreated to my armchair, picking up the book, and that's when I knew. That was the moment. He was a refugee in my home, and I was his harbor. The old rules were suspended. The old maps were useless. He had fallen asleep in the middle of my life, and I had the terrifying, exhilarating premonition that nothing would ever be the same again. I watched him breathe in the pre-dawn quiet, and for the first time, the hope I had kept locked away for so long began to rattle the door. That first night bled into a second, and then a third. A ritual began to form, unspoken and delicate. Liam would go to his own apartment during the day to pack Sarah's things into boxes, a grim, methodical task that seemed to drain him of what little energy he had. He would show up at my door in the evening, looking hollowed out, and I would let him in. Sometimes he would talk, rehashing the same painful memories, turning them over and over like smooth, dark stones. More often, he was silent. We would eat takeout sitting on the floor of my living room, or watch a movie that neither of us was really paying attention to. The space between us was charged with his grief and with my careful, vigilant tenderness. Each night, he would end up on the couch. He never asked again if it was okay. It was simply assumed. And each night, I would take up my post in the armchair, a silent sentinel watching over his fitful sleep. I learned the patterns of his exhaustion, the way his breathing would catch, the small, pained sounds he would make as his subconscious replayed the day's sorrows. I was becoming an expert in the topography of his sadness. My apartment, once my solitary sanctuary, had become a convalescent home for a broken heart. And my own heart was a mess of contradictions. I felt a profound, aching compassion for my friend, a genuine desire to see him healed. But tangled up with that was this terrible, selfish hope, a living thing that was growing stronger in the fertile ground of his vulnerability. I felt monstrous for it. I felt human. About a week into this new, strange cohabitation, something shifted. It was late, close to midnight. He had been quieter than usual all evening, withdrawn into a place I couldn't reach. He was lying on the couch, staring up at the ceiling, the gray blanket pulled up to his chin. I was at my desk in the corner, trying to edit a new series of photos I'd taken of winter trees, their bare branches like black veins against a white sky. The work was a comfort, a familiar rhythm. "I can't sleep," he said suddenly, his voice small in the quiet room. I turned in my chair. "Nightmares again." He shook his head, though he didn't look at me. "No, just my back. This couch is killing me." He said it as a simple statement of fact, but it hung in the air between us like a question. It was a piece of logistical bait, and we both knew it. He was testing the water, seeing if I would invite him further in. The space between the couch and my bedroom door suddenly felt like a vast, uncrossable chasm. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at me to ignore it, to offer him an extra pillow, to maintain the boundary that kept me safe. But I was so tired of being safe, and he looked so lost. I took a breath. "My bed is big enough for two," I said, my voice unnaturally casual. "If you want, you can take the side by the wall." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the distant siren of an ambulance. I was holding my breath. I had just opened a door that I had sworn to myself I would always keep bolted shut. He turned his head and finally looked at me. His eyes were dark, his expression unreadable. For a second, I was certain I had made a catastrophic mistake, that I had misinterpreted everything, that he would be disgusted or angry. But then he just nodded, a slow, almost imperceptible movement. "Okay," he whispered. "Thanks." The word was a release. He sat up, folded the wool blanket with a slow precision, and placed it on the arm of the couch. He walked the 10 feet from the couch to my bedroom door, and it felt like a procession. I stood up and followed him, my heart hammering a frantic, unsteady rhythm. This was it. The map was being redrawn in permanent ink. My bedroom was simple. A bed, a nightstand, a dresser. A large, framed photograph of a misty ocean on the wall. It was a quiet, monastic space. He walked to the far side of the bed, the one against the wall, as I had offered, and slid under the covers, still in his t-shirt and sweatpants. He turned his back to me immediately, a rigid line of defensiveness. I hesitated for a moment, then walked around to the other side and got in. The bed, which had always felt so large and empty, was suddenly a tiny, crowded island. I was hyper-aware of him, of the heat radiating from his body, of the slight depression his weight made in the mattress. I lay on my back, staring up at the ceiling, my muscles rigid. We were inches apart, but the space between us felt electric, dangerous. This was a new kind of silence. It wasn't the comfortable silence of our long drives, nor the grief-filled silence of the past week. This was a silence of pure, terrifying possibility. I didn't sleep at all that night. I listened to his breathing, waiting for it to deepen into the rhythm of sleep. But it remained shallow, alert. He was awake, too. We lay there for hours, two statues in the dark, pretending to be asleep, both acutely aware of the charade. Around 4 a.m, just as the first hint of gray light began to filter through the blinds, he shifted. A small movement, but it shattered the stillness. He rolled onto his back. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, slowly, tentatively, his hand moved across the small space between us, and his fingers brushed against the back of my hand. It was the barest whisper of a touch, so light I might have imagined it. But it sent a jolt through my entire body, a shockwave of heat and panic and a longing so sharp it was painful. I didn't pull away. I didn't react at all. I just lay there, my heart about to beat its way out of my chest, as his fingers rested against mine. After a moment, he withdrew his hand, rolling back onto his side, facing the wall again. But the ghost of his touch remained, burned into my skin. The ritual had escalated. A new clause had been added to our unspoken treaty. And as the sun came up, I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and thrilling, that we would never go back to the couch again. The bed became the new normal. The couch was abandoned, a relic of a previous, more cautious era. The pretext of his bad back was never mentioned again. It had served its purpose as the key to a locked door and was now discarded. Every night, he would arrive, and after our quiet, somber evening ritual, we would retreat to my bedroom. It became a sanctuary within a sanctuary, a space governed by a new and fragile set of rules we were writing as we went along. The first week in the bed was a masterclass in feigned nonchalance. We maintained a careful, almost comical distance between us, a buffer zone of sheet and blanket that felt as wide as a river. We slept back to back, two parentheses enclosing an empty space, the tension a palpable thing in the dark. I became an insomniac, a chronicler of the night. My photographer's eye, accustomed to observing the world from a distance, was now turned inward, focused on this tiny, shared geography. I learned the sound of his breathing, the subtle shift in its cadence that signaled his descent into sleep. I learned that he sometimes mumbled, fragmented words from dreams I couldn't access. I learned the way the moonlight, filtered through the blinds, would cast stripes of silver across the wall, a shifting, temporary mural that marked the passing hours. My own feelings were a turbulent ocean beneath a placid surface. I was drowning in proximity, in the constant, agonizing awareness of him. Every night was a test of my endurance, a 1,500-meter race against my own desires. Then, one night, the river between us began to narrow. It was a Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday. The days had started to blur into a single, continuous state of waiting. He had had a particularly bad day. He'd had to see Sarah to hand off the last of her things, a final, painful severance. He was wound tight with a quiet, vibrating misery when he arrived at my apartment. He barely spoke during dinner, just pushed food around his plate. When we finally went to bed, the silence was heavier than usual, thick with his unspoken anguish. We assumed our usual positions, back to back. I lay awake, listening to the strained sound of his breathing. He wasn't sleeping. He was trying to cry without making a sound, and the effort was causing his whole body to shudder in small, contained tremors. The sound was devastating. It was the sound of a strong man trying to hold himself together when he was already broken. Every compassionate instinct in me rose to the surface, eclipsing my fear and my caution. Slowly, carefully, I rolled onto my other side, so I was facing his back. The movement felt monumental. I hesitated, my hand hovering in the space between us. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. What was I doing? Was I crossing a line? Was I taking advantage of his pain? But the sound of his silent weeping was more compelling than any of my anxieties. I reached out and laid my hand gently on his shoulder. He went completely still. The tremors stopped. For a terrible, frozen moment, I thought he was going to pull away, to tell me to stop. I almost retracted my hand. But then, he let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of surrender. And he leaned back into my touch, just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough. It was permission. It was an invitation. Emboldened, I moved my hand from his shoulder to his back, resting it flat between his shoulder blades. I could feel the warmth of his skin through his thin t-shirt, the solid reality of him. We stayed like that for what felt like hours. Me, with my hand on his back, channeling every ounce of comfort and reassurance I could muster through that single point of contact. Him, slowly, gradually, relaxing under my touch, his breathing evening out, the rigid line of his spine softening. He never turned around. He never spoke. But when he finally drifted off to sleep, his body was no longer braced against his grief. He was simply at rest. And I lay awake behind him, my palm against his back, feeling like I was holding something infinitely precious and fragile. I had offered comfort, and he had accepted it. A new dimension had been added to our strange, silent language. Touch was now part of our vocabulary. From that night on, the dynamic in the bed shifted. The pretense of distance was gone. Touch became an accepted part of the ritual, a nightly balm for his frayed nerves. It started with my hand on his back as he fell asleep. Then, a few nights later, he was the one to initiate. As we lay in the dark, he rolled over to face me. My breath caught in my throat. In the dim light from the window, I could just make out the shape of his face, his eyes closed. He shifted closer, and closer still, until his forehead was resting against mine. He sighed, a deep, weary sound, and his arm came around my waist, pulling me against him. My entire body went rigid with shock. He was holding me, not in a passionate embrace, but in a gesture of pure, desperate comfort, like a child seeking warmth from a nightmare. His body was flush against mine, his legs tangled with mine. I could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against my chest. My mind was a riot of conflicting signals. This is wrong, one part of me screamed. He's using you as a placeholder for her. But another, quieter voice whispered, this is all he needs right now. Just be still. Just be here. I chose to listen to the quiet voice. I made myself relax, my muscles unclenching one by one. I wrapped my own arms around him, returning the embrace. He nestled his face into the curve of my neck, and his breathing began to deepen. Within minutes, he was asleep, his body heavy and pliant against mine. And I was left wide awake, holding him, my senses overwhelmed. The scent of his hair, the feeling of his warm breath on my skin, the solid weight of him in my arms. It was everything I had ever secretly wanted, and it was happening for all the wrong reasons. It was a beautiful, agonizing torture. This became the new ritual, cuddling. It was a word my brain shied away from, too domestic, too intimate for the fragile, undefined nature of what we were doing. But that's what it was. Every night, we would climb into bed, and he would turn to me and pull me into his arms, or I would pull him into mine. We would fall asleep tangled together, a knot of shared warmth and silent need. The days were still marked by a careful friendship, conversations about logistics, about his job hunt, about mundane things. We were two friends navigating a difficult time, but the nights were a different country altogether, a dark, silent landscape where our bodies spoke a language our mouths did not dare to. I lived a strange, bifurcated life. By day, I was the stoic, supportive friend. By night, I was the secret lover, though no lines of love had been crossed, no kisses exchanged. The physical intimacy was chaste, almost fraternal, yet it was charged with an undercurrent of something more that I was terrified to acknowledge. I was living inside a photograph I was afraid to develop, because once the image was fixed, it could never be changed. I was terrified that bringing it into the light would reveal that the picture was not what I hoped it was. Maybe I was just a comfort object, a human heating pad. The thought was a cold knot in my stomach. But then, in the middle of the night, he would stir, and his arm would tighten around me, pulling me closer in his sleep, and the knot would dissolve into a warm, spreading hope. This went on for weeks, which turned into a month, then two. The sharp edges of his grief began to soften. The boxes of Sarah's things were moved to a storage unit. He found a new job, a consulting gig that required him to travel occasionally. Color began to return to his face. His laughter, when it came, sounded more like its old self. He was healing. And with his healing came a new and terrifying question. What would happen to us? Our nightly ritual was born of his crisis. When the crisis was over, would the ritual end, too? Would he get his own apartment? And would my bed become large and empty once more? The thought filled me with a quiet, sickening dread. I had become addicted to the weight of him beside me, to the rhythm of his breathing in the dark. The foundation of my life had shifted to accommodate him, and I couldn't imagine it shifting back. I felt like I was standing on a cliff's edge. The situation was unsustainable. The ambiguity was eating me alive. I needed to know what this was, what we were. But I was a coward. I was the quiet observer, not the instigator. So I did what any coward would do. I decided to force the issue, but indirectly. I decided to try and set him up with someone. It was a terrible, self-destructive, passive-aggressive idea, born of desperation. My thinking, twisted as it was that his reaction would tell me everything I needed to know. If he was interested, then I had my answer. I was just a temporary comfort. If he wasn't, well, that was a possibility I barely let myself entertain. My chosen candidate was a woman named Chloe from my advanced darkroom class. She was smart, funny, with a dry wit and a cascade of dark, curly hair. In another life, I might have even been interested in her myself. She had asked about my roommate. Once, after seeing a new print I was working on, a candid shot of Liam making coffee in my kitchen, backlit by the morning sun, a study in domestic tranquility. I had mumbled something noncommittal. The plan was clumsy. I invited Liam out for coffee on a Saturday afternoon, to a little place near my apartment that Chloe frequented. My hope was that she would be there, and I could orchestrate a chance meeting. It was a plan worthy of a bad romantic comedy, and I felt a fool even as I was setting it in motion. Liam agreed easily. He seemed lighter these days, more like the man I had first befriended. The deep, settled sadness had been replaced by a kind of restless energy. We found a small table by the window. The cafe was busy, filled with the hum of conversation and the hiss of the espresso machine. I kept scanning the entrance, my nerves a tangled mess. Liam was talking about a potential work trip to Chicago, his voice animated. I was barely listening, just nodding and making affirmative noises, my attention fixed on the door. "You seem distracted," he said, cutting through my anxious surveillance. He was looking at me with a curious, searching expression. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, fine," I said too quickly. "Just thinking about a project." He didn't look convinced. He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes still on me. "You know," he said slowly, "I really appreciate everything you've done for me these last couple of months. I know I've been a lot to deal with." "Don't be ridiculous," I said, my heart clenching. "You're my best friend. Of course I was going to be there for you." The phrase best friend felt like ash in my mouth. "Still," he said, "I feel like I'm finally coming up for air. And I owe a lot of that to you." He gave me a small, genuine smile, and it was so full of affection, so warm, that it almost made me abandon my stupid, cowardly plan. Almost. But then, right on cue, the bell above the cafe door jingled, and Chloe walked in. My heart leaped into my throat. This was it. I raised a hand and waved her over, trying to look casual, surprised. "Chloe." "Hey." She smiled and came to our table. "Hey, Mark. Fancy seeing you here." Her eyes flickered to Liam, a spark of open curiosity in them. "Chloe, this is my friend Liam." "Liam, this is Chloe, from my photo class." The introductions were as awkward as I had feared. Liam was polite, shaking her hand, offering his usual charming smile, but his eyes kept darting back to me, a question in them. Chloe, for her part, was clearly interested. She directed most of her conversation to him, asking about his work, his swimming background, all the standard first encounter questions. I sat there, the architect of this excruciating scene, feeling my stomach slowly tie itself into a knot. This was a mistake. This was a terrible, terrible mistake. I was trying to prove something, but all I was doing was cheapening what we had, whatever it was. After a few minutes of strained but friendly conversation, Chloe excused herself to order. The moment she was gone, Liam turned to me. His smile was gone. His expression was a mixture of confusion and something else, something that looked almost like hurt. "What was that?" he asked, his voice low. "What was what?" I feigned ignorance. "She's a friend. I saw her and said hi." "No," he said, shaking his head. "That. You were setting me up, weren't you?" I couldn't meet his eyes. I stared down at my coffee cup. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Mark, look at me." His voice was quiet, but firm. I forced myself to lift my head. He was staring at me, his gaze intense, unwavering. "She seems nice," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, so I had to lean in to hear him over the cafe's noise. "She's pretty. She's funny. And a few months ago, I might have been interested." He paused, and the silence stretched, thick and heavy. I felt like I was falling. He took a breath. "But I'm not." He held my gaze, and the entire world seemed to narrow to the space between us. "I'm already interested in someone." And he just kept staring at me. He didn't blink. He didn't look away. The look in his eyes wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement, a confession, a revelation that landed in the center of my chest with the force of a physical blow. The hum of the cafe, the hiss of the espresso machine, Chloe standing at the counter. It all faded into a distant, irrelevant noise. There was only his face, his eyes, and the silent, earth-shattering meaning of his words hanging in the air between us. My carefully constructed world, with its locked rooms and secret corridors, had just been blown wide open. The seconds after his confession stretched into an eternity. My mind, usually so quick to analyze and categorize, was completely blank. It was like a camera with its shutter stuck open, overexposed by a sudden, blinding flash of light. He had said the words. He had said them, and he was looking at me. There was no ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation. The quiet observer in me, the one who lived behind the lens, was suddenly the subject of the photograph, pinned by the focus. I think I was supposed to say something. My role in this scene was to respond, to acknowledge, to reciprocate, but I was paralyzed. 1,000 unspoken feelings, years of carefully guarded hope and fear, were surging through me, creating a logjam in my throat. All I could do was stare back at him, my own expression probably a mask of stunned disbelief. The spell was broken by Chloe returning to our table, a latte in her hand. "The line was crazy," she said, oblivious to the seismic event that had just occurred. Liam tore his gaze from mine, and the connection was severed. He blinked, as if coming out of a trance. He offered Chloe a tight, polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, I actually have to run," he said, already pushing his chair back. He stood up, avoiding my gaze completely now. "I just remembered I have a call I need to make." "Oh," Chloe said, her face falling slightly with disappointment. "Okay. Well, it was nice to meet you." "You too," he said, his voice strained. He glanced at me, a quick, unreadable flicker of his eyes, and then he was gone, weaving through the tables and out the door without a backward glance. The bell jingled, announcing his departure. I was left sitting there, opposite a confused Chloe, the echo of his words still ringing in my ears. "Is he okay?" she asked, sitting down. "Yeah," I managed, my voice sounding distant and strange to my own ears. "He's just been under a lot of stress." I felt a profound wave of guilt. I had used her as a pawn in a game she didn't even know she was playing. I spent the next 10 minutes making awkward, stilted conversation before making my own excuses and leaving. I needed to get out of there. I needed to think. I walked home in a daze, the city streets a blur of motion and noise. "I'm already interested in someone." The words replayed in my mind on an endless loop. He had said it. He had meant me. He had to have meant me. The hope that I had kept on a starvation diet for years was now feasting, growing into a wild, unmanageable beast in my chest. But tangled with the euphoria was a growing thread of anxiety. He had fled. After making the most vulnerable confession of his life, he had run. When I got back to my apartment, it was empty and silent. His keys were on the small table by the door, but he wasn't there. I checked my phone. No texts. No missed calls. The silence was unnerving. The air, which just that morning had been filled with the comfortable domesticity of our shared life, now felt thin and charged with uncertainty. He didn't come back that night. The hours ticked by, each one heavier than the last. I sat in the armchair, the same one I'd occupied on that first night he'd stayed, and I stared at the couch. The apartment felt cavernous, hollowed out by his absence. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. A text from him. My heart leaped. "Hey, sorry about today. Staying at my place tonight. Need to sort some stuff out." That was it. No explanation. No emotion. Just a sterile, logistical message. The hope that had been soaring through me plummeted. Need to sort some stuff out. What did that mean? Did he regret what he'd said? Was he disgusted with himself, with me? Had I pushed him too far with my stupid, manipulative coffee shop stunt? The internal monologue that had been my constant companion for months spun into a frantic, paranoid spiral. I had misinterpreted the look. He had meant someone else, and his stare was one of pity for my obvious, pathetic feelings. He had run because he was horrified. I texted back, trying to keep my own panic out of the words. "No problem. Hope you're okay." He didn't reply. The next day was one of the longest of my life. The silence from him was absolute. I tried to work, to lose myself in the familiar chemical smells and the dim red light of my darkroom, but I couldn't focus. Every image I tried to develop seemed to mock me. The photo of him in the kitchen, the one that had prompted Chloe's question, felt like a relic from a lost civilization. The intimacy it had captured now seemed like a lie I had told myself. He was gone for 3 days. 3 days of agonizing silence. He didn't come to the apartment. He didn't call. He didn't text. He had simply vanished back into his own life, leaving a gaping hole in mine. The nightly ritual, the shared space, the quiet comfort, it was all gone. My bed was huge and cold. The silence in my apartment was no longer tender, it was mocking. I had flown too close to the sun, and the fall back to earth was brutal. The pain of his absence was sharper, more acute, than the dull ache of my previous, secret loneliness. I had tasted something I thought I could never have, and now it had been snatched away. The grief I felt was not for a broken friendship, but for a love that had been revealed and then immediately rejected. On the third night, I couldn't take it anymore. The quiet observer had to act. My fear of ruining our friendship was now eclipsed by the reality that the silence was already ruining it. I was filled with a cold, clear resolve. I needed an answer, even if it was the one I dreaded. I put on my jacket, grabbed my keys, and walked the 10 blocks to his apartment building. I stood outside the door to his unit for a full 5 minutes, my hand raised to knock, my courage failing me. What if he wasn't there? What if he was there, but wouldn't open the door? What if he opened it and looked at me with pity or disgust? But the thought of returning to my empty apartment, to another night of agonizing uncertainty, was worse. I took a deep breath and knocked. The sound was loud in the quiet hallway. I heard movement inside. Footsteps. The chain rattled, and the door opened a few inches. He peered out at me through the gap. He looked terrible. He was unshaven. His eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, and he was wearing the same wrinkled t-shirt he'd had on 3 days ago. He looked like he had when he'd first shown up at my door after his breakup with Sarah. He looked shipwrecked again. "Mark," he said, his voice rough. He didn't sound surprised, just weary. "Liam," I said, my own voice steadier than I expected. "We need to talk." He stared at me for a long moment through the narrow opening. I thought he was going to close the door in my face. But then he sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion, and unlatched the chain. He opened the door and stepped back, letting me in. His apartment was a mess. Half-packed boxes were everywhere, a testament to his aborted attempts to sort his life out. He didn't turn on the main light, so the room was cast in the cold, blue glow of the city lights outside his window. He didn't invite me to sit. He just stood in the middle of the room, his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture. "Liam, what happened?" I asked, my voice soft but insistent. "You disappeared. I told you. I needed to sort some stuff out." He mumbled, looking at the floor. "And did you?" I took a step closer. "Because you left me in a coffee shop after saying something, and then you vanished. You can't do that. You can't just drop a bomb like that and walk away." My voice was rising, filled with the hurt and frustration of the last 3 days. "I know," he whispered. "I'm sorry. I panicked." "Panicked about what?" I demanded. "About what you said. Did you not mean it? Was it a joke?" "Because if it was the cruelest joke you've ever played." "It wasn't a joke," he said, his head snapping up, his eyes flashing with a spark of his old fire. "Of course it wasn't a joke." He ran a hand through his messy hair, his whole body thrumming with agitation. "I don't know what it was. It just came out. I saw you there, trying to push me towards someone else, and it felt so wrong. And the words just, they were there. And I said them. He started pacing the small, cluttered space, like a caged animal. And the second I said it, and I saw the look on your face, it was like everything became real. All this. He gestured vaguely between us. All the nights at your place. It wasn't just me being a mess and you being a good friend anymore. It was something else. And it terrified me. Why? I asked, my heart aching for his confusion, for his fear. Why did it terrify you? He stopped pacing and looked at me, his expression one of raw, painful vulnerability. Because I don't know how to do this, Mark. I've only ever known how to be one way. With girls. With Sarah. It's a script I know. I know the lines. But this, with you, there's no script. I've been leaning on you, sleeping in your bed, holding on to you like a goddamn life raft. And I've been telling myself it's because I'm heartbroken. But that's not the whole truth, is it? He shook his head, a look of dawning, horrified realization on his face. The truth is, I think I stopped needing the life raft weeks ago. I just didn't want to let go. I didn't want to leave your apartment. I didn't want to sleep in my own bed. I wanted to be next to you. And I had no idea what that meant. I still don't. It feels huge and scary. And I'm afraid I'm going to ruin it. I'm afraid I'm going to ruin you, ruin our friendship, which is the most important thing in my life. He finally ran out of words, standing there breathless, his confession hanging in the air. All my anger, all my hurt, it all just dissolved, replaced by an overwhelming wave of tenderness. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified of his own feelings. He was the sprinter, used to short, explosive bursts, and he had found himself in a long-distance race, and he didn't know the pace. I closed the distance between us until I was standing right in front of him. Liam, I said, my voice quiet again. You can't ruin this. The only thing that was ruining it was the silence. The not knowing. The pretending. I reached out and took his hand. His skin was cold, but his fingers curled around mine instantly, his grip tight, desperate. You're right, I said, looking from our joined hands to his face. There is no script. We're going to have to write it ourselves. And it's okay to be scared. I'm scared too. His eyes, which had been so full of turmoil, softened. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the stubble on his cheek. You are, he whispered. I've been in love with you for years. I confessed, the words finally breaking free, simple and terrifying and true. I've been living on a cliff's edge for 2 months, terrified that any wrong move would send me falling. So yes, I'm scared. A small, shaky smile touched his lips. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. Oh, he said softly. Well, that makes a bit more sense then. He lifted his free hand and gently, hesitantly, cupped my jaw. His thumb stroked my cheek. His eyes searched mine, and all the fear and confusion was gone, replaced by a question. A different kind of question this time. A quiet, hopeful one. Would it be okay, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Would it be okay if I kissed you? And in that moment, all the years of waiting, all the nights of agonizing proximity, all the fear and the hope, it all coalesced into a single, perfect point of clarity. I leaned into his touch, closing my eyes. Yes, I breathed. It would be more than okay. The kiss, when it came, was not the explosive, passionate release I might have once imagined. It was something far better. It was hesitant, tentative, a soft and gentle pressing of his lips against mine. It was a question and an answer, a confession and an absolution. It tasted of salt from his tear and of a deep, profound relief. It was not the kiss of a sprinter, all fire and speed. It was the kiss of a man who had finally stopped running, who had found his rhythm, who had come home. I brought my own hand up to his neck, my fingers tangling in his hair, and I kissed him back, pouring all the unspoken words, all the locked-away feelings of the last 3 years into that one, simple, honest touch. We stood in the middle of his messy, half-packed apartment, in the cold blue light of the city, and we began to write the first line of our new script. After the kiss, a new kind of silence fell between us, but this one was different. It wasn't the silence of grief, or tension, or uncertainty. It was a silence of accord, of settlement. It was the quiet that comes after a storm has passed, leaving the air clean and calm. He rested his forehead against mine, our hands still linked between us. His breathing was shaky, but steady. So, he said, his voice a low murmur against my skin. What happens now? The question was practical, but beneath it lay a deeper one. What are we now? I felt a small smile touch my lips. For the first time, I felt like I had the answer. Now, I said, pulling back just enough to look him in the eye. You finish packing these boxes, but you're not putting them in storage. You're moving them to my place. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of the old fear returning. Mark, are you sure? That's fast. We've been living together for 2 months, Liam, I said gently. We've just been pretending we weren't. I'm tired of pretending. I want the real thing. I want to wake up next to you without a pretext. I want you to have your own drawer in my dresser. I want your coffee mug to be next to mine on the shelf, not as a guest, but because it belongs there. I watched as he processed my words. I saw the fear recede, replaced by a slow dawning wonder, and then a radiant, beautiful certainty. The smile that spread across his face was real this time, reaching all the way to his tired eyes, making them shine. My own drawer, he said, a note of playful awe in his voice. A whole drawer, I confirmed, my own smile widening. Maybe even 2, if you're lucky. He laughed, a real, genuine laugh, the sound I had missed so profoundly over the last 3 days. It was the sound of healing. Okay, he said, his grip on my hand tightening. Okay, a drawer sounds good. We didn't stay at his apartment that night. We walked back to my place, hand in hand, the cool night air feeling fresh and new. When we stepped into my apartment, it no longer felt empty. It felt like home. That night, when we climbed into my bed, there were no unspoken rules, no buffer zones, no feigned sleep. He turned to me, and I turned to him, and we came together with an ease that felt both brand new and anciently familiar. He wrapped his arms around me, and I buried my face in his chest, breathing in the scent of him, and for the first time in months, I felt my entire body relax. There was no anxiety, no analysis, no fear of misinterpretation. There was just the solid, warm reality of him, the steady beat of his heart under my ear, a rhythm that was now inextricably linked with my own. Mark, he whispered into my hair after a long, comfortable silence. Yeah. I'm sorry it took me so long to figure it out. I pressed a kiss to his chest. You were swimming a long race, I said. You just needed to find your pace. I felt him smile against my hair. I think I finally have, he said. And that night, for the first time in a very long time, we both slept soundly and deeply until morning. The days that followed were a quiet revelation. They were filled with the gentle, mundane tasks of merging 2 lives. We packed his boxes, and as we did, we talked. Really talked. He told me about his fears and insecurities, his confusion about his own feelings, his dawning realization that the comfort he felt with me was different, deeper, than anything he'd felt with Sarah. I, in turn, confessed the depth and breadth of my own long-held affection, the years of quiet observation, the photo box filled with his likeness. We were developing the image of our relationship, bringing all the hidden details out into the light, fixing them with honesty. Moving his things into my apartment was less of an upheaval and more of a correction. His books filled the empty spaces on my shelves. His clothes filled the 2 drawers I cleared for him in my dresser. His presence filled the rooms in a way that felt not like an intrusion, but a completion. My solitary sanctuary was transformed, but not violated. It had simply expanded to make room for him, and in doing so, it felt more like itself than ever before. The new normal was quiet, and it was beautiful. It was in the way he'd hand me a coffee mug in the morning without asking how I took it. It was in the way I'd know, just from the set of his shoulders, when he'd had a stressful day at his new job. It was in the easy, unspoken dance we did in the small kitchen. It was in the nights, which were no longer fraught with tension, but filled with a deep, peaceful intimacy. The cuddling continued, but it was no longer a desperate grasp for comfort. It was a simple, declarative statement of affection. It was home base. There are thresholds in a life, moments that arrive disguised as something ordinary. That first night he slept on my couch was one such threshold. It was a doorway I hadn't known was there, leading from a world of quiet longing into a new and uncharted territory. For a long time, we stood hesitating in that doorway, afraid of what was on the other side. But we learned that the most terrifying thresholds are often the ones that lead to the safest harbors. We learned that sometimes, The most profound love doesn't announce itself with a grand explosion, but reveals itself slowly, like a photograph developing in the dark, an image of home emerging from the patient silence. And in the beautiful, honest quiet we had finally learned how to create together, we found not just love, but a profound and lasting peace. We had found our pace, and we knew, with a certainty that was as steady as a heartbeat in the night, that we would be swimming this distance together,